The clock on the wall showed nearly midnight, and the steady ticking was the only thing breaking the silence in the house. The Christmas tree lights flickered out of rhythm, casting soft shadows across the living room walls. Alex was sunk into the couch, wrapped in a blanket that still carried the scent of his grandfather, that cedar and strong coffee smell, a scent now a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. That night, the house seemed larger and emptier than ever. The echo of his grandfather's laughter still seemed trapped in the walls, but it was just an illusion. Even the Christmas decorations looked different, dull, without purpose, as if they knew the heart of the family was no longer there to celebrate. In the center of the worn wooden table, a small gift waited. It had no fancy ribbons or the shiny metallic paper Alex used to see in Christmas commercials. It was simple. The paper was a faded red, with crumpled marks along the edges, and a thin golden ribbon held it firmly together. Even so, there was something about that gift that made Alex hesitate. Beside the package, a letter. The paper, slightly yellowed, exuded the characteristic scent of his grandfather's belongings. Alex had been holding it for minutes, but still couldn't get past the first few words. He had read the beginning so many times he could recite it by heart. "Alex, if you're reading this, I can no longer be there with you. But what I've left inside this gift is not just for today. It's for your entire life. You will understand when you open it. With love, Grandpa." The words were written in Henry's shaky handwriting. It was the kind of letter that seemed to weigh more every time Alex held it. He ran his finger over the words "your entire life," as if he could pull some clue from them about what it meant. Suddenly, the sound of soft footsteps came from the hallway. His mother entered the room, standing in the doorway for a moment as if hesitating to step forward. She looked as exhausted as he felt, her red, swollen eyes betraying hours of held-back tears. Still, she smiled faintly when she saw Alex holding the letter. "He wanted you to open it alone," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Alex nodded but didn't say anything. His eyes went back to the gift. He didn't want to open it. Opening it meant accepting that it was the end, and he wasn't ready for that. "What do you think is inside?" he asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. His mother stepped closer, hesitantly, and placed her hand on his shoulder. "I think it's something he knew you needed." Her answer didn't bring comfort, but Alex knew she was right. Henry always seemed to know what others needed before they even realized it. That was what made his absence so devastating. He was no longer there to fix things with his calm demeanor and endless stories. Alex looked out the window. The snow had started to fall slowly, covering the street with a thin, bright layer, as if hiding everything bad the world had to offer. He felt a twinge of anger mixed with sadness. How could the world look so beautiful when his heart was so broken? The gift was still there, waiting. Alex carefully picked it up, his hands trembling slightly, and pulled at the golden ribbon. He stopped, took a deep breath. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. His life would never be the same again. The golden ribbon slid slowly off the package. Each movement seemed to carry an eternity, as if time was slowing down just to amplify the subtle sound of the paper being torn. Alex hesitated. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't know if it was due to emotion or fear. The expectation hung in the room, as dense as the air before a storm about to break. Finally, he opened the wrapping and found something he never expected: an old journal. The leather cover was worn, with frayed edges and stains that seemed to tell their own stories. In the center, a single word was handwritten: truth. He frowned, confused. He ran his fingers over the cover, feeling its rough texture, and opened to the first page. It wasn't an ordinary journal. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and even clippings from old newspapers. Everything seemed scattered chaotically, yet at the same time meticulously organized, as if every detail had a purpose. He flipped through a few more pages, feeling a chill as he read scattered excerpts. "Every secret has its time to be revealed." The words were underlined, almost as if they were a warning. He continued flipping through and found a page full of numbers and symbols that didn't make sense. Further ahead, there was an old photograph of a house he didn't recognize. On the back of the photo, in shaky handwriting, it read, "The origin of everything." Alex stopped, His heart began to race. He looked at his mother, who was standing near him. She had a stiff expression, but her eyes betrayed her. There was something there. A recognition, maybe even fear. "Mom, did you know about this?" Alex asked, holding the journal out for her to see. She was silent for a moment, crossing her arms as if protecting herself. Finally, she sighed. "I knew he kept things from the past, but he never let me read them. He always said they were for you." "For me? Why?" Alex tried to control his tone, but disbelief was obvious. "Because he knew you'd want answers. More than any of us." Her words didn't comfort Alex. They only raised more questions. He flipped through a few more pages, but nothing there made immediate sense. It was as if the journal was speaking in a language he still needed to learn. Then, something fell from the middle of the pages. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to echo in the room in silence. Alex bent down to pick up the object. It was a small key, attached to a faded red ribbon. He held it up to the light, examining the details. It didn't look like any key he had ever seen before. It was made of dark metal, with an intricate design that seemed to come from another century. He looked at his mother again. "What is this?" She slowly shook her head, her face growing even paler. I don't know." "You don't know? How is that possible? You knew about the journal, but not this?" His mother looked away and pressed her lips together, as if struggling with the words she wanted to say. "Alex, some things are better left as they are. Not every secret needs to be unearthed." Those words triggered something inside him. It was as if she was trying to snuff out the last spark of hope he was feeling. "Leave it as it is? He trusted this to me. He wanted me to see it," Alex replied, his voice rising an octave. His mother took a step back, surprised by the intensity of his response, but didn't say anything. Instead, she crossed her arms again and looked out the window, where the snow was falling in heavy flakes. Alex felt his blood boil. He looked at the journal, at the key, and then at his mother. Everything in him screamed that this was important, that it couldn't be ignored. He stood up with the journal and the key in his hands. "If this was important to him, then it's important to me," he said firmly. Without waiting for a response, he turned and climbed the stairs. The sound of the creaking steps echoed through the house, and he slammed the bedroom door behind him. In the room, Alex sat on the edge of the bed. The journal was in his lap, and the key rested beside it. He stared at the open pages, but the words now seemed like smudges. His mind was racing. Why would his grandfather keep something like this? Why give it to him, and not his mother? And why did everything feel so secret? He picked up the key again, spinning it between his fingers. It felt heavy, even though it was small. And somehow, he knew that this key was not just an object. It was a symbol. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a white and serene blanket. But inside Alex, everything was chaos. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in his chest. He knew he needed answers, but something in his heart told him that the answers wouldn't be easy to find. And maybe, just maybe, those answers could change everything. Alex sat on the edge of his bed, staring down at the worn leather journal resting in his lap. His fingers traced the edges of the cover, feeling the rough texture of the aged material. The small metal key sat beside him on the bed, catching the soft glow of his bedside lamp. It was an ordinary key at first glance, but something about its intricate design felt purposeful, like it was made to open something far more significant than just a lock. He leaned back against the wall, letting out a long breath as the reality of the moment settled in. The journal, the key, the cryptic notes, all of it felt like a puzzle his grandfather had deliberately left behind. Alex's mind raced with questions. Why now? Why him? What kind of secrets could his grandfather have been keeping? And why had no one mentioned any of this before? Flipping the journal open, Alex took a closer look at its contents. The handwriting was familiar, but shakier than he remembered. His grandfather's usual neat penmanship had given way to hurried scrawls, like someone racing against time to capture every thought. Among the pages were scattered sketches, fragmented phrases, and newspaper clippings so old their edges were starting to crumble. One page stood out immediately. The words were bold, underlined multiple times. go to where it all began. Beneath the phrase, there was a rough sketch of a house. It wasn't a house Alex recognized, but something about it felt strangely familiar. The windows were uneven, the roof slightly slanted, and a large oak tree stood off to one side. In the corner of the page, his grandfather had written a single sentence: "You will find the answers in the place I once called home." Alex's heart tightened. His grandfather had occasionally mentioned his childhood home, but only in passing. Henry had always been a man of stories, but when it came to his own life, he was more guarded. Alex turned to the next page, where another note had been carefully scrawled: "Trust the key and trust yourself. The truth will set you free." His fingers brushed against the key again, picking it up almost instinctively. It was small, slightly tarnished, but its design was intricate, with tiny patterns etched into the metal. It felt ancient, like it had been passed down through generations. He tried to connect the dots in his mind, but the more he thought about it, the more questions he had. What was his grandfather trying to tell him? And why had he waited until now to share it? Before Alex could spiral further into his thoughts, there was a soft knock at his door. "Alex?" His mother's voice was quiet, hesitant. He hesitated before responding. "Come in." The door creaked open, and his mother stepped inside. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes immediately went to the journal in his hands, and her expression shifted, part recognition, part apprehension. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she crossed her arms and sighed. "Your grandfather always loved his secrets," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of fondness and frustration. Alex looked up at her, his grip tightening on the key. "What is this, Mom? Why did he leave this for me?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the journal before meeting his eyes. "I don't know everything," she admitted, "but I know enough to tell you. This isn't something you should be digging into." "Why not?" Alex's voice rose slightly, frustration creeping in. "If it was important enough for him to leave this behind, don't you think I deserve to know?" His mother walked over to the bed and sat down on the edge, keeping a careful distance from the journal. She looked at him, her expression softening. "Alex, some things are better left in the past. Your grandfather? He had his reasons for keeping certain parts of his life private. Digging them up now won't change anything. It'll only make things harder." Alex frowned, her words only fueling his curiosity. "You're saying that because you already know what's in here, don't you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the journal but stopped short of touching it, her hand hovering over the cover. "I know enough," she finally said. "Enough to know that what you find might not give you the peace you're looking for." Her words stung, but they only strengthened his resolve. He sat up straighter, holding the journal close to his chest. "Maybe it's not about peace. Maybe it's about understanding him. Understanding us." His mother's lips pressed into a thin line, and she shook her head. "Just be careful, Alex. Once you start down this path, you can't go back. Some doors, once they're opened, stay open." With that, she stood and left the room, her steps heavy as she disappeared down the hallway. Alex stared after her for a moment, the weight of her warning lingering in the air. But it wasn't enough to stop him. He looked back at the journal and the sketch of the house. The words "where it all began" echoed in his mind. He reached for his phone and typed the coordinates he had found scrawled on one of the pages into a mapping app. The location popped up, a small, rural area about 2 hours outside of town. It was late, and the snow outside was falling harder now, but Alex felt an urgency he couldn't ignore. He grabbed the journal, the key, and his coat, stuffing them into a bag before heading downstairs. As he opened the door to leave, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the house. For a brief second, he thought about turning around, about letting the mystery stay unsolved. But then he stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin as the snow crunched beneath his boots. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he wasn't about to stop now. The night was unrelenting, with snow falling in thick, heavy flakes that blanketed everything in sight. The quiet hum of Alex's car was the only sound as it pushed through the whitened countryside, its headlights casting narrow beams onto the winding road ahead. The journal lay open on the passenger seat, its aged pages fluttering slightly from the heat blowing through the car's vents. The key sat on top of the journal, gleaming faintly under the dim overhead light. The voice in his head was louder than the storm outside. His grandfather's words, "Go to where it all began," played over and over like a broken record. What did it mean? What was waiting for him at the end of this drive? The GPS instructed him to turn onto a narrow road barely visible beneath the snow. He hesitated, glancing at the ominous darkness ahead, but he turned the wheel anyway. The tires crunched through the icy buildup, slipping slightly as the road narrowed further, trees now forming a dense tunnel on either side. As the car crept forward, Alex's mind raced. He thought back to the conversation with his mother, her cryptic warnings still fresh in his memory. Some doors, once they're opened, stay open. Her voice had been filled with a kind of fear he wasn't used to seeing from her. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from not knowing. It was the fear of knowing too much. "What are you hiding, Mom?" Alex whispered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the thick trees blocking out what little light the night sky offered. Then, as if out of nowhere, his GPS chimed. "You have arrived at your destination." Alex squinted through the windshield, and there it was, barely visible through the snowfall. The house. It stood at the end of the road, partially hidden by overgrown trees and bushes that were now coated in snow. It looked exactly like the sketch in the journal, down to the massive oak tree looming beside it. The house seemed to lean to one side, its weathered wood and broken shutters giving it an air of abandonment. The windows were dark, empty, and lifeless, like hollow eyes staring back at him. He parked the car at what he guessed had once been a driveway, now just a stretch of snow-covered weeds. Cutting the engine, he sat there for a moment, staring at the house. A strange mix of anticipation and dread churned in his stomach. "This is it," he muttered, almost to convince himself. Stepping out of the car, he was immediately hit by the biting wind. The snow swirled around him as he zipped his coat up higher and pulled his scarf tighter. The journal and the key were clutched tightly in his hands as he trudged through the snow toward the front porch. The steps creaked loudly under his weight, and for a brief moment, he thought about turning back. But then he remembered the photograph in the journal, the house, the cryptic coordinates, the words scrawled in his grandfather's shaky handwriting. He couldn't stop now. The front door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted and barely holding on. He pushed it open with a soft groan, the sound echoing unnervingly in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. "Grandpa, what did you leave me here for?" Alex muttered under his breath, stepping cautiously into the entryway. The room was sparse. A single armchair near the fireplace, a wooden table in the center, and a tarnished chandelier that hung precariously above. His footsteps left faint impressions in the layer of dust on the floor as he moved further in. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint whistling of the wind through the cracks in the walls. He flipped open the journal again, holding it up to the dim light from his phone's flashlight. The sketch of the house stared back at him, and beneath it, the note his grandfather had written. "Look for what's hidden in plain sight." Alex scanned the room, his heart pounding. There was nothing remarkable about the furniture or the fireplace, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. Then, in the corner of the room, he saw it. A small cabinet, unassuming but strangely out of place. Its lock glinted faintly in the light, and Alex's pulse quickened. The lock was ornate, the kind of design that seemed to match the intricate patterns on the key he was holding. He approached it slowly, his boots creaking against the floorboards. Kneeling in front of the cabinet, he examined the lock before pulling the key from his pocket. It felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of everything his grandfather hadn't told him. With a trembling hand, Alex slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The soft click of the lock releasing was almost anticlimactic, but Alex felt a rush of adrenaline as he carefully opened the cabinet door. Inside was a wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, covered in intricate carvings. He lifted it out slowly, the weight of it surprising him. Placing it on the table, he took a deep breath before opening the lid. Inside were photographs, faded but meticulously arranged. Alex picked up the first one, his heart stopping as he stared at the image. It was his grandfather, Henry, standing in front of this very house. But he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman Alex didn't recognize, holding a baby in her arms. Flipping the photo over, he found writing on the back, 1948. Margaret, Henry, and David. Alex's breath caught. He didn't know anyone named David. His hands began to shake as he reached for another photo. This one was of the same woman, Margaret, but she was standing alone, holding the baby. Behind her was a sign that read, St. Mary's Orphanage. Alex sat back in the chair, his mind spinning. An orphanage? Who was David? Why had his grandfather never mentioned any of this? The weight of the discovery pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt the full gravity of the secrets buried here. This wasn't just about his grandfather's past. It was about his family's identity, and perhaps his own. Alex sat frozen, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands. The faded black and white image showed a younger version of his grandfather, standing proudly in front of the house. But it was the people beside him who commanded Alex's attention. There was a woman with soft curls framing her face, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. In her arms, she cradled a baby swaddled in a blanket. Alex's chest tightened as he flipped the photo over, revealing a scrawled message on the back. 1948. Margaret, Henry, and David. David. The name hit Alex like a physical blow. He whispered it aloud, testing the weight of it on his tongue. He had never heard that name before, not at a single family gathering, not in any of his grandfather's countless stories. Alex's mind raced as he set the photo aside and reached back into the box. Beneath the stack of old photographs, he found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon felt delicate, as if it might disintegrate with the slightest pull, but Alex carefully untied it and unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, delicate but hurried, as if the writer had been holding back tears while penning each word. Dear Henry, I can't keep doing this on my own. David deserves more than I can give him, but the thought of letting him go breaks my heart. Please, come back. I need you. Forever. Margaret. The words blurred as Alex read them, his throat tightening. He could feel Margaret's pain radiating through the fragile paper. She wasn't just pleading for help, she was begging for a lifeline. Margaret. The name felt distant, unfamiliar. Who was she? And more importantly, who was David? Alex's hands trembled as he unfolded another letter. Mr. Henry Bennett, we regret to inform you that Margaret Jacobs has relinquished custody of David Bennett as of June 12, 1948. The child has been placed in the care of St. Mary's Orphanage until further arrangements can be made. Sincerely, Father Charles Morris. Alex read the letter again, and then a third time, each pass deepening the pit forming in his stomach. Margaret had given David up. His grandfather's son, his own uncle, had been left behind at an orphanage. Alex's breath quickened as his mind filled with questions. Why hadn't his grandfather stayed to help Margaret? What had forced her to make such a painful decision? And why had none of this ever been spoken about in his family? Setting the letters aside, Alex reached back into the box and pulled out another item. It was a locket, small and rusted, with intricate carvings etched into the surface. He opened it carefully, revealing two delicate keepsakes inside. On one side was a tiny black and white photograph of Margaret, her features soft and serene. On the other side was a lock of hair, light and wispy, clearly from a baby. Alex closed the locket with a sharp click and leaned back in the chair, his mind spinning. This can't be real, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible in the heavy stillness of the house. But it was real. The photographs, the letters, the locket, they weren't just pieces of someone else's story. They were pieces of his story, pieces of a family he'd thought he knew. He stood abruptly, pacing the room with the locket clutched tightly in his hand. The wooden floor creaked under his boots, the sound jarring in the silence. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out to see a message from his mother. Alex, please come home. We need to talk. Alex stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. She knew. She had known all along. Maybe not every detail, but enough to know what he'd find. Enough to let fear seep into her voice when she warned him not to dig too deep. He ignored the message, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't ready to face her, not yet. Not when there were still so many unanswered questions. He turned back to the journal, flipping through the pages frantically, looking for anything that might give him a clue about what had happened to David after St. Mary's Orphanage. Near the back, he found a short note, scribbled hastily in his grandfather's handwriting. The truth isn't in the house, it's in the letters. Follow the paper trail. The letters. Alex's gaze darted back to the stack of correspondence on the table. He picked them up again, flipping through them more deliberately this time. Some were from Margaret, others from St. Mary's Orphanage. But there were gaps, whole years missing, where the story seemed to vanish into the ether. Alex's frustration boiled over as he slammed the letters back onto the table. "Where is the rest of it?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. His grandfather had left breadcrumbs, but the trail was incomplete. There were pieces of the puzzle missing, and Alex knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he found them. He carefully placed the letters, photos, and locket back into the wooden box, then closed it with a snap. Grabbing the journal, he scanned the sketch of the house one last time. His grandfather's words lingered in his mind. Go to where it all began. This house was only the first step. The answers weren't here. They were out there, somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. As Alex stepped back outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap. The snow had slowed, but a thick layer now covered his car and the ground around him. He brushed the snow off his windshield with his gloved hand before climbing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and he sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His breath fogged up the windows as he stared out at the dark road ahead. This wasn't just about uncovering a family secret anymore. It was about understanding who his grandfather really was, and by extension, who Alex himself might be. He pulled the car into reverse, the tires crunching through the snow, and began driving away from the house. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, the silhouette of the old house seemed to linger, watching him leave. The truth felt closer now, yet somehow farther away than ever. The car's heater struggled to keep up with the frigid morning air, the windows fogging slightly as Alex drove down the snow-covered highway. He hadn't slept, his mind too full of questions. Every time he closed his eyes, the same image returned. The photograph of his grandfather, Margaret, and the baby, David. The name lingered like a ghost in his thoughts, one he'd never heard before but now couldn't forget. The locket, resting on the passenger seat next to the journal, seemed to radiate an almost tangible weight. It wasn't just an artifact, it was proof. Proof of a life, a story, and a family history Alex had never known existed. His phone screen lit up with the same webpage he'd found during his sleepless hours, a listing for the County Historical Society, the keepers of St. Mary's Orphanage records. The orphanage had closed decades ago, but some of its archives had been preserved. Somewhere in those files might be the key to understanding what had happened to David. Alex tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the road signs announced he was nearing his destination. The snow had slowed, but the world outside was still blanketed in white. The bare trees along the highway looking skeletal against the overcast sky. When he pulled into the small parking lot outside the Historical Society, his stomach churned with nervous energy. The building was unremarkable, a single-story brick structure with narrow windows and a sign that read County Historical Archives. It didn't look like the kind of place where life-changing discoveries happened, but Alex knew better than to trust appearances. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust. A woman sat at the front desk, her glasses perched low on her nose as she flipped through a thick book. She glanced up as Alex approached, offering a polite but curious smile. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you?" "Hi," Alex began, his voice uncertain. "I'm looking for records from St. Mary's Orphanage. I saw online that they're archived here." The woman nodded and pushed her glasses higher. "Yes, we do have some of their records. Are you looking for anything specific?" Alex hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Finally, he settled on honesty. "I'm looking for information about someone named David Bennett. He would have been at the orphanage in the late 1940s. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "David Bennett? Yes, Alex confirmed. He was my grandfather's son. I just found out about him, and I'm trying to piece together what happened. The woman's expression softened, and she nodded. Give me a moment. I'll check our archives and see what we have. She disappeared through a door marked Records, leaving Alex standing alone in the quiet lobby. The seconds stretched into minutes, and Alex felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. His fingers tapped absently on the counter as he stared at the door, willing her to return. Finally, she emerged, carrying a thin manila folder. This is everything we have on David Bennett, she said, handing it to him. It's not much, but hopefully it'll help. Alex took the folder with a quiet thank you and moved to a small table in the corner of the room. He opened the folder carefully, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the first document inside. The top sheet was an intake record, dated June 15, 1948. It listed David's name, his age, 7 months, and the reason for his placement. Relinquished by mother due to financial hardship, Alex swallowed hard, his throat tight. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind, but he pushed them aside and turned to the next document. It was a letter from the orphanage's director to Henry Bennett. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but the words were clear. Mr. Bennett, we regret to inform you that St. Mary's is unable to hold David indefinitely without further communication from you. If we do not hear from you by October 1st, 1948, he will be placed for adoption. Sincerely, Father Charles Morris. Alex's breath hitched. He read the letter twice, then a third time, hoping the words might change. Why hadn't his grandfather responded? What had stopped him from coming back for his son? The final item in the folder was a photograph. Alex's chest ached as he stared at the image. It showed a group of children sitting on the orphanage steps, their faces small and solemn. A name was scrawled neatly on the back. David Bennett. Alex leaned back in the chair, the photo trembling in his hands. The boy in the picture couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, his expression serious, almost haunting. Somewhere out there, David had grown up without his family, without Henry. The idea made Alex's stomach churn. For his whole life, he'd seen his grandfather as a man who put family first. Yet here was proof that Henry had abandoned his own son. He set the photo down carefully, rubbing his hands over his face. There was more to this story. There had to be. He picked up the intake record again, scanning it for any detail he might have missed. Come on, he muttered, his eyes darting over the page. There's got to be something. A faint note in the corner caught his attention. Adoption inquiry filed October 3rd, 1948. See adoption records for details. Alex's heart raced. Adoption inquiry? Someone had taken an interest in David. There might be more information, another lead. He stood abruptly and returned to the front desk. The woman looked up, startled by his sudden approach. Do you have the adoption records for St. Mary's? He asked, his voice tinged with urgency. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the folder in his hands. We have some, but not all. It depends on the year. Can you check? She nodded slowly. Give me a few minutes. Alex watched as she disappeared into the archives again. His thoughts were spinning, a mix of hope and dread. If David had been adopted, the records might tell him where he'd gone. They might even give him a chance to find him. When the woman returned, she was holding another folder. We have something, she said. Alex took it, his heart pounding. As he sat back down at the table, he opened the folder and scanned the top page. His eyes widened as he read the words. Adopted by James and Helen Crawford. Renamed Daniel Crawford. Placement finalized December 10th, 1948. Alex's breath caught in his throat. David, now Daniel, had been adopted. He had a new name, a new family, a whole new life. Beneath the adoption record was another photograph, this one taken years later. It showed a boy of about 8, his dark eyes steady and determined. In the corner, someone had written, Daniel, age 8. Alex stared at the image, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time, he could put a face to the name. This was his grandfather's son, his uncle, and he was still out there. Alex sat frozen at the small table, his eyes locked on the name written in neat cursive on the adoption record, Daniel Crawford. The letters seemed to burn into his mind. rewriting everything he thought he knew about his family. David Bennett wasn't just a forgotten part of their history. He had been given a new name, a new life, and left to vanish into the world. He stared at the photograph beneath the adoption papers. The boy in the image, his uncle, Daniel, looked older than in the first photo, his eyes sharper, more aware. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and there was a hint of a smile on his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Alex ran his fingers over the edge of the photo, as if touching it could bridge the decades that separated him from the boy in the picture. "Where did you go?" he whispered. "What happened to you?" He flipped the adoption record over, scanning the fine print for anything that might help him. A faint line near the bottom caught his attention. Adoptive parents, James and Helen Crawford. Residence, Hastings, Nebraska. Nebraska. It wasn't far, just a few hours' drive from where Alex was now. His heart began to pound. Was there a chance that Daniel, or his descendants, might still be there? The sound of a chair scraping across the floor startled him. He looked up to see the woman from the front desk approaching cautiously. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice soft. Alex nodded, though his thoughts were racing too fast for him to form a proper answer. "Yeah, I think so." She hesitated, glancing at the folder in his hands. "It's always a bit surreal, isn't it? Finding pieces of the past you didn't know existed." Alex managed a faint smile. "That's one way to put it. If you need anything else, let me know," she added before heading back to her desk. Alex sat there for another moment, staring at the adoption record. The address for the Crawfords was decades old, but it was a start. He packed the papers and photos carefully back into the folder, then tucked it into his bag alongside the journal and the locket. The drive to Hastings felt both endless and impossibly short. Snow flurries danced in the air as Alex navigated the rural roads, the barren winter landscape stretching out in every direction. His thoughts were a whirlwind, alternating between hope and doubt. Would Daniel still be alive? If he wasn't, would Alex be able to find his family? Would they even want to talk to him? The GPS directed him toward a small residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Hastings. As Alex turned onto the street listed in the adoption record, he felt his chest tighten. The houses were modest, built in the 1950s and 60s, with wide front lawns now buried under snow. He pulled up to the address and parked on the street. The house was still there, a small, white one-story home with green shutters. It looked well-kept but unremarkable, blending into the quiet street. Alex sat in his car for a moment, his fingers drumming anxiously on the steering wheel. What was he expecting to find here? The Crawfords might not even live in this house anymore. And even if they did, how could he explain who he was and why he was there? Taking a deep breath, he reached for the journal and the folder, clutching them tightly as he stepped out into the cold. His boots crunched against the icy sidewalk as he approached the front door. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the still air. For a moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound from inside the house. Alex's heart sank. Maybe no one lived here anymore. But then he heard it, the faint shuffle of footsteps approaching the door. It opened slowly, revealing a woman in her 70s. She wore a cardigan over a simple blouse, her gray hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her expression was cautious but polite as she looked at Alex, her eyes flickering to the folder in his hands. "Can I help you?" she asked. Alex hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to begin. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for someone who might have lived here. Daniel Crawford." The woman's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the door. "Who are you?" Alex swallowed hard. "My name's Alex Bennett. Daniel. He was my grandfather's son. I just found out about him, and I'm trying to learn more about what happened." For a moment, the woman didn't respond. She seemed to study Alex, her sharp eyes searching his face. Then, she opened the door a little wider and stepped aside. "Come in," she said quietly. Alex stepped into the warm house, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. The living room was cozy, with mismatched furniture and family photos lining the walls. "Have a seat," the woman said, motioning to the couch. She sat down in an armchair across from him, her posture straight, her gaze steady. "I'm Helen Crawford," she said. "Daniel was my son." Alex's heart raced. "Was? Helen nodded, her lips tightening. He passed away about 10 years ago. Cancer. The words hit Alex like a blow, and he leaned back slightly, struggling to process them. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen nodded again, her expression softening. It was a long time ago, but I'd like to know, how did you find us? Alex explained everything, the journal, the letters, the records at the Historical Society. As he spoke, Helen's eyes glistened, and she occasionally glanced at the photographs and documents he showed her. I didn't know any of this until a few days ago, Alex finished. I had no idea my grandfather had a son, or that he gave him up. Helen sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. Daniel always wondered about his birth family. He didn't talk about it much, but I could tell it weighed on him. Alex hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Did he have a good life? Helen smiled faintly. He did. He was smart, kind. He became a teacher. He married a wonderful woman, and they had 3 kids. Alex's breath caught. 3 kids? Yes, Helen said. They're grown now, with families of their own. She stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a photo album. Sitting beside Alex, she opened it to a page showing Daniel surrounded by his children, all smiling warmly at the camera. Alex stared at the image, a strange mix of emotions washing over him. Sadness for the time lost, but also relief. Daniel's life hadn't been defined by his abandonment. He had built something beautiful. Helen looked at him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. If you'd like, I can put you in touch with them. I think they'd want to know about you. Alex nodded, his throat tight. I'd like that. As he sat there, surrounded by pieces of a family he'd only just discovered, Alex felt a sense of connection he hadn't expected. He still had questions, so many questions, but for the first time, he also had a path forward. Alex sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee that Helen had insisted on making. The house felt small but lived in, with framed photos filling every available surface. Each one told a story, a wedding, a holiday, children playing in a backyard. He scanned the faces in the pictures, searching for glimpses of Daniel. Helen sat across from him, holding the photo album she had retrieved. Her hands rested gently on its cover, her expression thoughtful. It's strange, she began, her voice low and steady. For years, Daniel wondered about his birth family. He never resented them, but he always had questions. Alex leaned forward. Did he ever try to find them? Helen nodded. Once. It was when he was in his early 20s, not long after we told him he was adopted. He contacted the orphanage, but by then, St. Mary's had closed, and the records were scattered. He didn't know where to look next in life. Well, it got busy. Alex nodded, his chest tightening. The idea of Daniel searching for answers and finding nothing felt like a cruel twist of fate. Helen opened the album and flipped through its pages. I always told him that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who love you. But I know he wanted closure. She paused, stopping at a page with a photo of Daniel holding a young boy on his shoulders. I think he would have been glad to know you. Alex studied the picture. Daniel was older in this one, his face framed by lines that hinted at both laughter and worry. The boy on his shoulders, no older than 6, was grinning broadly, his arms stretched out as if flying. Who's this? Alex asked, tapping the photo gently. Helen's face softened. That's Mark, Daniel's youngest son. He's 30 now, married, with a little girl of his own. Alex's mind raced. Mark was his cousin, a family member he'd never known existed. And the others? Sarah is the oldest. She's a nurse in Colorado, Helen said, pointing to another picture of a young woman with a kind smile. And Emily. She's a teacher, like Daniel was. For a moment, Alex was speechless. He had spent so much of his life feeling disconnected, as if something was missing, and now, here it was. An entire branch of his family tree, waiting to be discovered. Do you think they'd want to meet me? He asked finally, his voice hesitant. Helen smiled. I think they'd be curious, at the very least. You're part of their story, too, whether they knew it or not. She stood and walked to a small desk in the corner, opening a drawer and pulling out a notepad. She wrote down 3 names and phone numbers, then handed the paper to Alex. "This is where you can reach them," she said. "But take your time. This is a lot for anyone to process, and you'll want to approach it carefully." Alex nodded, staring at the paper as if it were made of gold. "Thank you. I mean it. Thank you for trusting me with this." Helen reached out and squeezed his hand. "Your family, Alex. That's what Daniel would have wanted." Later that day, Alex sat in his car outside a small diner on the edge of Hastings, the folded piece of paper resting on the dashboard. He had ordered food, but he hadn't touched it. His mind was too preoccupied, replaying the conversations with Helen over and over. He picked up his phone, staring at the first number on the list, Sarah. His thumb hovered over the call button, his heart pounding. What would he even say? Taking a deep breath, he pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi," Alex began, his voice shaky. "Is this Sarah Crawford?" "Yes, this is Sarah. Who's calling?" Alex hesitated for a moment, then pushed forward. "My name is Alex Bennett. I think I'm your cousin." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Alex's stomach twisted. Had he made a mistake? Was she going to hang up? "My cousin," she repeated finally, her tone cautious but not unkind. "I don't understand. I just found out about your dad, about Daniel. He was my grandfather's son. My family didn't even know about him until recently. I've been trying to piece everything together." The silence returned, but this time it felt heavier. Alex could hear her breathing, could feel her processing what he just said. "Okay," Sarah said slowly. "I'm going to need a little more information. Can you explain?" For the next few minutes, Alex told her everything. How he'd found the journal, the letters, and the records at the Historical Society. He spoke quickly, trying to cover as much as he could while giving her room to absorb it all. When he finished, Sarah let out a long breath. "Wow," she said. "That's a lot. I had no idea my dad had any connection to another family. He never mentioned it." Alex felt a pang of guilt. "I don't think he knew much either. My grandfather didn't talk about it. I think it was something he tried to forget." "That sounds like him," Sarah said softly. "He didn't like to dwell on the past." There was another pause, then Sarah's tone shifted, warmer now. "This is all so surprising, but I think we should meet. I'd like to hear more. And I'm sure my brother and sister would too." Alex's breath caught. "Really?" "Yes," she said. "Your family, after all." They agreed to meet the following weekend, giving Sarah time to talk to her siblings. After the call ended, Alex sat back in his seat, staring at his phone. He had spent so long wondering what it would feel like to belong, and now, for the first time, he felt like he was on the verge of finding out. The diner was nearly empty as Alex sat in a booth by the window, staring at his untouched plate of fries. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, leaving the streets quiet and coated in a shimmering layer of white. The phone call with Sarah replayed in his mind, her voice shifting from cautious curiosity to a warm openness that caught him off guard. She had said yes. She wanted to meet. Alex exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It felt surreal. A week ago, he hadn't even known Daniel existed, and now he was about to meet his children, his cousins. Part of him was excited, but another part was terrified. What if they didn't like him? What if this whole situation brought up feelings they weren't ready to deal with? His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "Looking forward to meeting you. Mark and Emily are on board too. Let's meet at the Bluebird Cafe in Lincoln, 2 p.m. Saturday. See you soon." Alex read the message twice, a nervous smile creeping onto his face. He quickly typed back, "Can't wait. See you then." The rest of the week passed in a blur. Alex spent hours poring over the journal and the letters again, trying to piece together every detail he could about Daniel's early life. He wanted to be prepared for their questions, but he also felt a responsibility to present the story in a way that honored his grandfather's memory. When Saturday arrived, Alex woke up early, too anxious to sleep in. He dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, trying not to overthink his appearance, but he still checked the mirror at least 3 times before leaving. The drive to Lincoln felt longer than it should have. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of the Bluebird Cafe, his palms were damp and his stomach was in knots. The cafe was warm and inviting, with large windows that let in the afternoon sunlight. Alex spotted Sarah immediately. She was sitting at a corner table near the back, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Beside her were two others, a man and a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the boy in the photo Helen had shown him. Taking a deep breath, Alex walked over. Sarah looked up and smiled, standing to greet him. "Alex?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat. "Hi. It's nice to meet you." She extended her hand, but instead of shaking it, Alex felt a warm hug. The gesture caught him off guard, but immediately eased some of his nerves. "This is Emily," Sarah said, motioning to the woman beside her, who gave Alex a kind smile. "And Mark." Mark stood and shook Alex's hand firmly. "Nice to meet you, man." "Nice to meet you all," Alex said, taking a seat across from them. For a moment, there was an awkward silence as they all sized each other up. Then Sarah leaned forward, breaking the tension. "So, this is crazy, huh?" she said, smiling. Alex laughed nervously. "Yeah, that's one way to put it." Emily tilted her head, studying him. "How did you even find us? I mean, this whole thing is just wild." Alex nodded, pulling the journal from his bag and placing it on the table. "It started with this. It belonged to my grandfather, Henry. He left it for me before he passed away." He opened the journal, flipping to the photo of the house and the notes about David. As he explained the letters, the records, and his discovery of Daniel's adoption, the three of them leaned in, their expressions shifting between fascination and disbelief. "I had no idea," Sarah said softly when he finished. "Dad never mentioned anything about his birth family. Not once." Mark frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. "Do you think he knew? Like, deep down?" Alex shrugged. "From what Helen told me, he had questions but never got answers. He reached out to the orphanage once, but by then it was too late." Emily's eyes glistened, and she looked away for a moment, composing herself. "That must have been hard for him," she said. "Not knowing." "It's hard for me too," Alex admitted. "I've spent my whole life thinking I knew everything about my family. And then this changes everything." The table fell silent again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes from shared understanding, from realizing you're not alone in your thoughts. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I'm glad you reached out, Alex. I know Dad would have wanted this." "Really?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "Yeah," Sarah said firmly. "He wasn't the type to hold grudges. If he knew you were part of his story, he would have wanted to know you." Mark nodded. "And I think it's good for us too. It's a chance to learn more about where we come from." Emily smiled at Alex. "Family's important, even the parts you don't see coming." The conversation lightened after that, shifting to stories about Daniel and the life he had built. They told Alex about his love of books, his passion for teaching, and his knack for telling the worst dad jokes imaginable. Each story painted a picture of a man who had lived a full, meaningful life, despite the questions that had haunted his early years. By the time they left the cafe, Alex felt a connection he hadn't thought possible. Sarah, Emily, and Mark weren't just distant relatives. They were people he wanted to know, people he wanted to keep in his life. As they stood in the parking lot, Sarah pulled him into another hug. "Keep in touch, okay? We want to hear more about your side of the family too." "I will," Alex promised. Mark clapped him on the back. "Next time, dinner's on me." Alex laughed. "Deal." As he watched them drive away, Alex felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so untethered. He had found something he didn't even know he was searching for, a family he could call his own. The sun was beginning to set as Alex drove back to his motel, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange. The roads were quiet, save for the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. The day had been emotionally exhausting, but a strange sense of peace had settled over him. Meeting Sarah, Emily, and Mark had felt like stepping into a new world, one that was both foreign and familiar. Their stories about Daniel had given him a clearer picture of the man his grandfather's son had become, a man who had taken the pieces life handed him and built something beautiful. When Alex reached the motel, he parked and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the folded piece of paper on the dashboard. It held the phone numbers of his newfound cousins, along with Sarah's handwritten note, "We're family now. Let's stay in touch." The words made him smile, even as a pang of regret tugged at his chest. He wished his grandfather were here to see this, to know that despite the secrets and the pain, something good had come from it all. Inside his room, Alex kicked off his boots and dropped onto the bed. The journal, now a constant companion, sat on the nightstand. He reached for it, flipping through its pages with a mix of familiarity and reverence. Each word, each sketch, felt like a thread connecting him to the man who had left it behind. Near the back, he found a note he hadn't noticed before, written in his grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. "If you've come this far, Alex, then you've already learned what matters most, the strength of family. But there's one more thing you need to know." Alex's heart quickened as he read the words. His fingers traced the edges of the page, the weight of his grandfather's voice heavy in his mind. "You'll find the rest at the place where I met Margaret." The lake. The lake. Alex's brow furrowed as he tried to recall any mention of a lake in the stories his grandfather used to tell. Nothing came to mind, but the directive was clear. There was more to this story, something his grandfather had deliberately saved for the end. Pulling out his phone, Alex searched for lakes near Hastings and quickly found one that matched the vague memory forming in the back of his mind. Lake Millstone. It was less than an hour's drive away. Alex leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. He was tempted to go right then, to finish the journey that had consumed him for the past week. But his body begged for rest, and he knew he needed to approach this final chapter with a clear mind. The next morning, Alex woke before dawn, the sky still dark as he packed up his things and checked out of the motel. The drive to Lake Millstone was quiet, the roads winding through open fields and clusters of bare trees. By the time he arrived, the first hints of sunlight were peeking over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the frozen expanse of water. The lake was serene, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Alex parked near the edge of a dirt path and stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. He pulled his coat tighter around him as he followed the path, the journal tucked under his arm. The trail wound through the trees before opening onto a small clearing overlooking the lake. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden bench, weathered and worn but sturdy. Alex approached it cautiously, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and reverence. He sat down, the journal resting in his lap. For a moment, he simply stared at the lake, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the pale sky above. He tried to imagine his grandfather here, decades ago, meeting Margaret for the first time. What had they talked about? What had drawn them together? Opening the journal to the last page, Alex found another note. This one was longer, the handwriting shakier than before, as if it had been written in haste. "Alex, if you're reading this, it means you've found the truth. You've uncovered the pieces of my life that I tried so hard to bury. For that, I owe you an explanation. When I met Margaret, I was a young man with nothing to my name but dreams too big for my small-town roots. She was a force of nature, kind, brave, and so full of life. We fell in love quickly, maybe too quickly. When David was born, I wanted to be the father he deserved, but life didn't make it easy. I made mistakes, Alex. I let fear and pride guide me when I should have stayed. Margaret did her best, but the world wasn't kind to single mothers back then. When she gave David up, it broke both our hearts, but I told myself it was for the best. I convinced myself that he'd have a better life without me. I spent years trying to forget, but the truth never left me. Every Christmas, every birthday, I thought about him. When I had your mother, I promised myself I'd do better, but the guilt never went away. I'm not proud of the choices I made, Alex, but if this journal finds you, it means I've finally done something right. It means you found the family I couldn't hold on to. Take care of them, Alex. Take care of yourself, and know that even in my failures, I loved you all more than words can say. Grandpa. Alex's hands trembled as he read the final words. The weight of his grandfather's regret and love pressed down on him, but so did a strange sense of relief. He finally understood. Looking out at the lake, Alex felt the wind pick up, rustling the pages of the journal. It was as if his grandfather's voice was carried on the breeze, urging him forward. Alex stood, staring out over the water. For the first time, he didn't feel lost. The pieces of the past had fallen into place, and now it was up to him to carry them forward. Alex stood at the edge of Lake Millstone, the morning light shimmering across the frozen surface. The letter from his grandfather lingered in his mind, its words a bittersweet mix of regret and hope. The journal sat heavy in his hands, but for the first time since he had opened it, he didn't feel weighed down by its contents. The truth was no longer a mystery. It was a responsibility. He walked back to the car slowly, his boots crunching over the snow-dusted path. As he opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at the journal one last time before closing it and placing it carefully on the passenger seat. He had found the answers his grandfather had hidden, but now a new question burned in his mind. What would he do with this knowledge? Later that afternoon, Alex pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of home bringing a wave of comfort. He had been away for days, and the weight of the journey was finally catching up to him. But something about returning felt different this time, lighter. His mother's car was parked out front, and Alex hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. She was in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove, the rich aroma of chicken soup filling the air. She turned when she heard the door close, her face softening in relief. "Alex," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she approached. "You're back." "Yeah," Alex said, setting his bag down by the door. "It's been a long week." His mother studied him for a moment, her gaze flickering to the bag. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Alex nodded. "I did." She hesitated, then motioned to the table. "Come sit. Tell me about it." They sat across from each other, the journal resting on the table between them. Alex opened it carefully, flipping to the photographs and letters he had uncovered. He explained everything: Margaret, the adoption, Daniel's life, and his children. His mother listened in silence, her expression shifting from shock to sadness to quiet understanding. "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. I always knew your grandfather kept things to himself, but I never imagined." "Neither did I," Alex said softly, "but I think he wanted us to know, even if it took this long." His mother nodded, reaching out to touch the journal gently. "It makes sense now, why he always got quiet around Christmas. I used to think he was just reminiscing about Grandma, but he must have been thinking about them too." Margaret and David. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelations settling over them. "What are you going to do now?" his mother asked. Alex thought about Sarah, Emily, and Mark, the family he had just begun to know. He thought about the letter, his grandfather's final plea to take care of the family he had lost. "I'm going to stay in touch with them," Alex said firmly. "Daniel's kids, they deserve to know where they come from, and I want to get to know them too." His mother smiled faintly. "Your grandfather would have liked that." Alex nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "I think so too." Over the next few weeks, Alex and his newfound cousin stayed in touch, exchanging texts, calls, and photos. Sarah sent him pictures of Daniel as a young man, including one of him holding a book with a mischievous grin. "Dad loved reading," she had written. "He always said books could take you anywhere, even if you couldn't leave home." Alex found himself smiling every time his phone buzzed with a new message. The connections he was building felt genuine, like pieces of his life falling into place. One Saturday, he received an unexpected call from Mark. "Hey, Alex," Mark began, his voice warm but slightly hesitant. "We've been talking, and we'd like to invite you to a family dinner. Just something small, at Emily's place. It feels like the right time." Alex's heart swelled. "I'd love that." The dinner was set for the following weekend. When Alex arrived at Emily's house, he was greeted by the sounds of laughter and the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. Sarah opened the door, grinning. "Come on in. We've been waiting for you." Inside, the atmosphere was lively and welcoming. Emily was setting the table, and Mark was teasing his nephew about a football game. The room was filled with warmth, not just from the food or the fireplace, but from the genuine connection Alex felt with these people. During dinner, they shared stories about their lives, laughing over childhood memories and swapping embarrassing moments. Alex told them about his own family traditions, the ones his grandfather had started, like making hot cocoa from scratch every Christmas Eve, a tradition Alex now saw in a new light. By the time dessert was served, Alex felt like he had known them for years. As the evening wound down, Sarah handed Alex a framed photograph. It was one he hadn't seen before: Daniel, smiling with his arm around a younger Sarah, standing in front of their old house. "I thought you'd like to have this," Sarah said. Alex accepted the frame, his throat tight. "Thank you. This means a lot." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're part of this family now, Alex. Don't forget that." Driving home that night, Alex felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. His journey had started with a single journal, filled with secrets and regrets, but it had led him to something far greater: connection, understanding, and a family he didn't even know he needed. He glanced at the photo sitting on the passenger seat, next to the journal. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "Take care of them, Alex." And he would. The days after the family dinner felt like a blur for Alex, filled with a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. He had spent so long chasing answers, piecing together fragments of a hidden story, that now, with the truth laid bare, he wasn't sure how to move forward. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let the connections he'd made with Sarah, Emily, and Mark fade into the background. Most evenings, Alex found himself sitting in his small living room, surrounded by the remnants of his journey. The journal sat open on the coffee table, alongside the photographs and letters he had gathered from the Historical Society and from Helen. Together, they told a story of love, loss, and resilience. A story that was now as much his as it was his grandfather's. One night, as Alex carefully sorted through the items, his phone buzzed on the cushion beside him. It was a text from Sarah. "Hey, Alex. Random question. Do you have any recipes from your grandpa? We were talking about holiday traditions, and it made us realize we don't have much from Dad's side of the family. Thought maybe you'd have something we could try together." Alex smiled, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. His grandfather had been a lover of Christmas traditions, and food was always at the heart of them. Some of Alex's earliest memories were of standing in Henry's kitchen, the counters cluttered with bowls of batter, jars of spices, and trays of cookies waiting to go into the oven. He quickly texted back, "I think I might. Let me check." Setting his phone aside, Alex moved to the small bookshelf in the corner of his kitchen. Tucked between cookbooks and old magazines was a worn leather binder. He pulled it out carefully, the familiar feel of the cracked spine bringing a smile to his face. This was Henry's recipe collection, a hodgepodge of handwritten notes, magazine clippings, and recipes scrawled on the backs of envelopes. Sitting down at the table, Alex flipped through the pages. Each recipe was written in his grandfather's neat handwriting, often accompanied by little notes like, "Add an extra dash of cinnamon. It makes all the difference," or "Best with a cup of hot cocoa." Toward the middle of the binder, one recipe caught Alex's eye: Grandpa Henry's Christmas spice cake. Alex's chest tightened as memories came flooding back. The spice cake had been a staple of every Christmas Eve, its warm, rich aroma filling the house as Henry carefully layered cream cheese frosting over its golden surface. It wasn't just a dessert, it was a tradition. Without hesitation, Alex snapped a picture of the page and sent it to Sarah. "How about this? Grandpa used to make it every Christmas. It's one of my favorites." Her reply came almost instantly. "This looks perfect. Let's plan a baking day. I'll call Emily and Mark." The following Saturday, Alex arrived at Sarah's house with the recipe binder tucked under his arm and a bag of ingredients in hand. The house was already buzzing with activity when he stepped inside. Finally, Sarah called from the kitchen, grinning as she spotted him. "We've been waiting for you, Master Chef." "I'm pretty sure Grandpa's the real Master Chef," Alex replied with a laugh, setting the binder on the counter. The kitchen was a flurry of motion. Emily was mixing a bowl of frosting with the kind of precision that only a teacher could muster, while Mark was attempting to measure flour but had somehow managed to spill half of it onto the counter. "Good thing I'm not the only disaster here," Alex teased, stepping in to help. "Hey, I'm a quick learner," Mark shot back, smirking. They quickly fell into a rhythm, each of them taking on a different task. Alex oversaw the batter, showing Emily how to fold in the spices just the way Henry had taught him. Mark handled the frosting, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as he carefully measured the cream cheese and sugar. Sarah prepped the cake pans, lining them with parchment paper and laughing every time Mark accidentally knocked over a measuring cup. As they worked, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. It was a smell that instantly transported Alex back to his childhood, to those snowy Christmas Eves spent in Henry's kitchen. "You know," Sarah said as she slid the filled cake pans into the oven, "this is the first time we've ever baked something from Dad's side of the family. It feels special." Alex nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "It does." While the cake baked, they sat around the kitchen table, sharing stories about their grandparents and their own childhood traditions. Alex told them about the way Henry used to sing off-key Christmas carols while he cooked and how he insisted on decorating the tree with the same old, mismatched ornaments every year. "That sounds exactly like something Dad would do," Sarah said, laughing. By the time the cake was ready, the kitchen was filled with the kind of warmth that went beyond the oven. Sarah carefully pulled the pans from the oven, setting them on the counter to cool. The golden brown cakes rose perfectly, their tops slightly domed. Once the frosting was ready, they worked together to assemble the cake. Mark, ever the perfectionist, took charge of spreading the frosting, his brow furrowed in concentration. Emily added a final sprinkle of cinnamon on top, stepping back to admire their work. "It's perfect," Sarah said, snapping a picture. They gathered around the table, each of them cutting a slice and taking a bite. The flavors were exactly as Alex remembered, warm, rich, and comforting. For a moment, the kitchen was quiet as they all savored the taste. "This is amazing," Mark finally said. "Tastes like Christmas." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining. "It's like he's here with us." Emily reached out to squeeze Alex's hand. "Thank you for sharing this with us. It's like a little piece of Grandpa Henry." Alex swallowed hard, emotions welling up in his chest. "I'm just glad we could do it together." That night, as Alex drove home, the photo of the cake sitting on his phone felt like more than just an image. It was a memory in the making. He thought about how far he had come since opening the journal, how the journey had taken him from unanswered questions to a kitchen filled with laughter and connection. Once home, Alex sat down at his kitchen table and opened the recipe binder. Flipping through the pages, he realized there was something powerful about these recipes. They were stories in their own way, pieces of history passed down through generations. He picked up his phone and started typing a message to Sarah. "What do you think about putting together a family recipe book? Something to honor both Grandpa Henry and Grandpa Daniel. We could include recipes, stories, photos, everything that ties us together." Her reply came almost immediately. "I love that idea. Let's do it." For the first time in years, Alex felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not just a part of a family, but an active thread in its tapestry, weaving together the past, present, and future. Alex's kitchen had become his unofficial workspace over the next few weeks, the recipe binder always open on the counter as he worked on the idea he'd proposed to Sarah. A family recipe book? The project had quickly evolved from a simple collection of dishes into something much bigger. Each recipe he included wasn't just about the ingredients. It was a piece of his family's story. Every page was paired with notes, photos, and memories that connected the food to the people who had made it special. Sarah, Emily, and Mark had embraced the project with enthusiasm. They sent Alex pictures of their family's favorite meals, handwritten recipes from their mother, and even a few of Daniel's own contributions, simple comfort foods like chicken pot pie and his signature pancakes, which the three siblings claimed were unmatched. One evening, as Alex was sorting through the latest batch of photos and recipes Sarah had emailed, his mother called. "Hi, Mom," Alex said, balancing the phone between his ear and shoulder as he arranged the photos on the table. "Hey, sweetheart," she replied, her voice warm. "I just wanted to check in. How's the recipe project coming along?" "It's actually kind of amazing," Alex admitted. "I didn't think it would turn into something this meaningful, but it feels like we're creating a family history book, not just a cookbook." His mother was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather would be proud, Alex. He always believed food brought people together." Alex smiled. "I think he'd like this. It's like we're keeping him, and Daniel, alive in a way. I can't wait to see it when it's finished," his mother said. "You'll be the first person I show," Alex promised. The next weekend, Alex drove to Lincoln to meet with his cousins again. They had decided to dedicate an afternoon to the recipe book, pooling their ideas and memories to create something truly collaborative. When Alex arrived at Sarah's house, the kitchen table was already covered with papers, photos, and recipe cards. "Look who finally decided to show up," Mark teased as Alex walked in. "Hey, I had to stop for coffee," Alex shot back, holding up a tray of cups. "Figured you'd need fuel for this." "Smart man," Emily said, grabbing a cup and taking a sip. They settled around the table, diving into the mountain of materials. Sarah had brought old photo albums, and Emily had printed out scanned copies of handwritten recipes from their mom's collection. "Okay," Sarah said, flipping open a notebook. "We need a theme. Something that ties all of this together. How about something simple, like from our table to yours?" Emily suggested. Mark shook his head. "Too generic. This is about family, right? It should reflect that." Alex thought for a moment, then said, "What about threads of the past? It's about weaving our stories together, connecting the people we've lost with the family we're building now." The table fell silent for a moment, and then Sarah smiled. "I love it. It's perfect." They spent hours piecing the book together, each page telling its own story. There was a section dedicated to Henry's recipes, including his Christmas spice cake and handwritten tips. Another section focused on Daniel, featuring the meals he had passed down to his kids. "Don't forget Mom's mac and cheese," Mark said, sliding a recipe card toward Sarah. "Oh, definitely," Sarah said. "That's a Crawford classic." As the afternoon wore on, the conversation drifted into stories about their grandparents, their parents, and even their own childhoods. Each memory added a new layer to the book, making it more than just a collection of recipes. By the time they finished for the day, the rough draft of Threads of the Past was starting to take shape. Alex stared at the pages spread across the table, feeling a swell of pride. This is really something," he said. "It is," Sarah agreed. "And it's because of you, Alex. You brought us together." Alex shook his head. "I think Grandpa Henry and Grandpa Daniel did most of the work. I just followed the trail they left." Mark clapped him on the back. "Well, you followed it pretty damn well." "This is incredible." Emily nodded. "I can't wait to show this to our kids someday. It's like giving them a piece of where they come from." The thought warmed Alex's heart. For so long, he had felt disconnected, like there was a missing piece of his life that he couldn't quite name. But now, surrounded by his cousins and the stories they had built together, he realized he had found it. That night, back at his apartment, Alex sat at his desk, flipping through the rough pages of the recipe book. He paused on a photo of Daniel holding his 3 children, the same smile that Alex had seen in the journal's letters now shining through in the faces of his cousins. He reached for the journal, turning to the final note from his grandfather. "Take care of them, Alex. Take care of yourself." For the first time, Alex didn't feel the weight of those words as a burden. Instead, they felt like a promise, one he intended to keep. As he closed the journal, Alex knew that this was only the beginning. The story of his family wasn't just something from the past. It was something they were writing together, one recipe, one memory, one connection at a time. Weeks turned into months as Alex and his cousins worked tirelessly on the recipe book, refining every detail until it became a family masterpiece. What started as a simple collection of recipes had evolved into a deeply personal tribute, a record of shared traditions, lost connections, and the love that bound them all together. Each recipe told a story. Some were accompanied by old photos, like Henry's Christmas spice cake, paired with a picture of Alex as a child, standing proudly beside his grandfather in the kitchen, both covered in flour. Others came with handwritten notes from Daniel, like his recipe for chicken pot pie, scribbled on the back of an envelope, complete with his favorite joke about always forgetting to add peas. "Keep it simple, or they'll roll away." The note read, a little piece of Daniel's humor that his children cherished. The project wasn't just about food. It became a journey through time, reconnecting the family with their roots and building a bridge between the past and the future. For Alex, it was also about healing, both for himself and the family his grandfather had left behind. One crisp December evening, Alex sat at his kitchen table, staring at the first completed copy of the recipe book. Its cover was a soft cream color, with the title threads of the past embossed in gold. Below the title was an illustration of a family tree, its branches extending out like the arms of someone offering a warm embrace. As Alex flipped through the glossy pages, he felt a swell of pride. The introduction he had written was simple but heartfelt. This book is more than a collection of recipes. It's a story of love, resilience, and connection. It's about the meals that brought us together, the traditions that shaped us, and the people who made it all matter. To our grandfathers, Henry and Daniel, whose lives remind us of the power of family, and to everyone who continues their legacy around the table, Alex paused on a page featuring a picture of Daniel, surrounded by his 3 children, their faces lit with joy. It felt right that this project was being shared now, during the season that had always meant so much to his grandfather. The days leading up to Christmas were a flurry of preparation. Alex coordinated with Sarah, Emily, and Mark to print enough copies of the book for the entire family. Emily handled the logistics, ensuring the books arrived on time, while Sarah worked on adding a few final touches, like personalized inscriptions for each recipient. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered at Emily's house for their traditional holiday dinner. The living room was warm and inviting, lit by the soft glow of string lights and the flickering flames of the fireplace. A towering Christmas tree stood in the corner, its branches adorned with a mix of new ornaments and old ones that had been passed down through generations. The smell of roasted turkey, spiced cider, and freshly baked rolls filled the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and conversation. It was the first time Alex had seen the entire extended family together since his journey began, and the sight filled him with a deep sense of gratitude. As the meal wound down, Alex glanced at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. He took a deep breath and stood, holding one of the recipe books in his hands. The room quieted as everyone turned to look at him. "I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you," Alex began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This year has been unexpected, but it's also been one of the most meaningful times of my life. Finding all of you, learning about Daniel and Grandpa Henry. It's been a gift I didn't even know I needed." He paused, looking around the room, his gaze lingering on Sarah, Emily, and Mark. Family is complicated. It's messy, and sometimes it feels broken, but it's also the most important thing we have. And this, Alex held up the book, his smile widening. "This is our way of honoring that." He walked over to Helen, Daniel's wife, and handed her the first copy. She took it with trembling hands, her eyes already misting with tears. As she flipped through the pages, a soft smile spread across her face. "This is beautiful," Helen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She paused on a photo of Daniel, his arms wrapped around a young Sarah. "He would have loved this." "Thank you." Alex continued handing out the books, each recipient's face lighting up as they flipped through the pages. His mother hugged him tightly after receiving her copy, her voice breaking as she said, "You've made your grandfather proud, Alex." "I know it." The rest of the evening was filled with quiet moments of reflection and joyous conversation. Family members gathered in small groups, sharing stories inspired by the recipes and photographs in the book. "Remember when Grandpa Henry used to sneak us extra cookies when Mom wasn't looking?" Alex's mom said, laughing as she showed a picture of a young Henry baking with Alex. "Oh, and Daniel's pancakes," Sarah added. "He used to stack them so high. We'd call it the Leaning Tower of Breakfast." The laughter was contagious, rippling through the room like the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. Mark walked over to Alex, holding his copy of the book. "You did something incredible here, Alex," he said, clapping him on the back. "This isn't just a book, it's a legacy, and it's ours." Later that night, as the family gathered around the Christmas tree to exchange gifts, Alex felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The recipe book had done more than he could have imagined. It had brought them closer, giving them a shared history to celebrate and a future to look forward to. As the evening wound down, Alex stepped outside for a moment, the cold air biting at his cheeks. Snow was falling softly, blanketing the neighborhood in a quiet stillness. He looked up at the sky, his breath visible in the crisp air. "I hope I did right by you, Grandpa," Alex whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the snow crunching beneath his boots. In his heart, he felt the answer. He had taken the threads of his family's past, the love, the loss, the memories, and woven them into something whole, something worth sharing. The first days of the new year brought a welcome calm to Alex's life. After the whirlwind of the holidays and the emotional depth of creating threads of the past, he finally had time to sit with his thoughts. His apartment was quiet, the recipe book resting on the coffee table beside the journal that had sparked everything. Alex found himself flipping through the journal often, not because he was searching for anything new, but because it felt like sitting down with his grandfather. Each page was a reminder of the man who had left behind so much more than secrets. He had left Alex a purpose. The recipe book had exceeded all expectations. Over Christmas, it had been the star of the family gathering, bringing laughter, tears, and a newfound closeness that felt like a gift in itself. Sarah had sent Alex a photo of her kids attempting Henry's Christmas spice cake, their faces dusted with flour as they grinned triumphantly at the camera. "We've got a new tradition here," her message read. "Next year, they're insisting on doing it without my help. Pray for the kitchen." Mark had taken to experimenting with variations of Daniel's chicken pot pie, proudly texting Alex photos of his creations, each one more elaborate than the last. "Gourmet chef in the making," one message said, accompanied by a picture of a perfectly golden crust. Even Helen had reached out, her gratitude palpable in her message. "Thank you, Alex. This book brought me closer to Daniel again. I can't tell you how much it means to me." For Alex, those messages were more than just words. They were proof that the journey he'd embarked on had been worth it, that uncovering the past wasn't just about finding answers, but about building bridges. One snowy afternoon, Alex sat at his kitchen table with the journal open in front of him. Though he had read it cover to cover, he still found comfort in its pages, in the way it captured his grandfather's voice and the pieces of his life that had once been hidden. He stared at a blank notebook next to the journal, his mind swirling with ideas. The recipe book had been a success, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that it was just the beginning. There was something powerful about collecting family stories and weaving them together with traditions. It was more than preservation. It was a way to celebrate the connections that shaped people's lives. He jotted down a few thoughts in the notebook. Preserving family stories, recipes, photos, helping people capture their history in a way that feels alive. The more Alex wrote, the clearer his vision became. What if the recipe book wasn't just a one-time project? What if it was the start of something bigger, something that could help other families do what his had done? The following week, Alex met Sarah, Emily, and Mark at their favorite cafe. Snowflakes drifted outside the windows as they gathered around a corner table, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. "So," Sarah said, stirring her latte, "what's this big idea you wanted to talk about?" Alex leaned forward, his excitement bubbling over. "I've been thinking a lot about the recipe book. It's not just a collection of recipes, it's a way of telling our family's story. And I think there's something special about that, something we could share with other families." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're saying we should, what? Start a recipe book business?" "Not just recipe books," Alex explained. "Family books. A way to capture stories, recipes, photos, anything that connects people to their roots. We could help them preserve their legacies in a way that feels meaningful." Emily's face lit up. "That's such a great idea. There are so many people who don't even know where to start when it comes to family history. We could guide them through it." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "It's definitely something people would value. Everyone loves the idea of preserving their family's story, but most people don't have the time or know how to do it." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're onto something, Alex. People don't just want keepsakes, they want connections. And that's what we could give them." They spent the next hour brainstorming, tossing around ideas and sketching out rough plans on napkins. Alex proposed starting small, working with a few families to create custom books as a trial run. Sarah suggested reaching out to local community centers to find people interested in preserving their family histories. Emily, ever the teacher, offered to handle the organization and timelines. By the time they left the cafe, the group was buzzing with excitement. For Alex, the conversation had solidified something he'd been feeling for weeks. This wasn't just an idea, it was a calling. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Alex and his cousins officially launched their project, naming it Family Threads in honor of their recipe book. They started small, working with a handful of families to create custom books that combined recipes, photographs, and personal stories. Each project was a journey of discovery. One family, the Millers, shared the incredible story of their grandparents meeting during World War II and exchanging love letters across continents. Another family, the Rodriguezes, offered recipes passed down for generations, each dish tied to a specific celebration or tradition. For Alex, every book they created reinforced what he had learned during his own journey. Family wasn't about perfection. It was about the messy, beautiful, complicated stories that brought people together. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. Alex spent hours conducting interviews, scanning fragile photos, and carefully editing handwritten recipes. Every project felt like a labor of love, and with each completed book, he saw the joy it brought to the families they worked with. One evening, after wrapping up a call with a client, Alex sat at his desk, flipping through the pages of Threads of the Past. A framed photo of Henry and Daniel rested beside it, their smiles a reminder of the journey that had started it all. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Guess what? We just made Grandpa Daniel's pancakes for dinner. The kids are obsessed. When are you coming over again? They said they're saving you a stack next time." Alex laughed, typing back quickly. "Soon. Tell them I'm holding them to that promise." Setting his phone down, Alex leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. The journey that had started with a dusty old journal had led to something far greater than he could have imagined. It had given him not only a family but a purpose, to preserve the stories that made them who they were and to help others do the same. As Alex closed the journal, he whispered softly, "I'll take care of them, Grandpa. All of them." And for the first time in his life, Alex felt not only connected but whole. Spring brought new energy to Alex's life, both in his personal journey and in the work he was building with his cousins. Family Threads had begun to grow beyond their initial expectations. What had started as a small side project to help a handful of families was quickly gaining traction through word of mouth and local community networks. Emails and inquiries began pouring in, with people from all walks of life reaching out to preserve their family stories. Some wanted to document their grandparents' immigration journeys. Others hoped to capture the recipes that had been passed down for generations. Every story was unique, and each one reinforced Alex's belief in the importance of this work. One sunny morning, Alex met with Sarah and Emily at a local library, where they had reserved a meeting room to plan their next steps. Mark couldn't join in person, but his face filled one of the boxes on Sarah's laptop screen, the video call ensuring he didn't miss out on the discussion. "Okay," Emily began, spreading out a list of upcoming projects on the table. "We've got 7 active books right now, and 3 more families who are interested in starting next month. At this rate, we're going to need to streamline how we work." "Streamline?" Mark asked from the screen, raising an eyebrow. "Do you mean we're going to have to stop winging it?" Emily rolled her eyes. "Yes, Mark. We need a system. Something that makes this sustainable." Alex leaned forward, tapping his notebook. "I've been thinking about that. What if we create a standard process, something that balances structure with flexibility? We could offer a basic package for people who just want recipes and photos, and then a more detailed option for families who want in-depth interviews and storytelling." Sarah nodded. "I like that. It would make things more manageable for us, while giving people options that fit their needs." Emily jotted down notes as Alex continued. "We could also start looking for other collaborators, writers, designers, maybe even local historians. People who can help us expand without losing the personal touch that makes this special." Mark grinned. "Does this mean I get to be the face of the operation? You know, the guy who does all the PR? Only if you promise not to scare away the clients," Alex teased. The room filled with laughter. a reminder of how much fun they were having despite the challenges. In the weeks that followed, Family Threads began to take on a life of its own. Alex and his cousins worked tirelessly to refine their process, creating templates for interviews and developing a streamlined approach to collecting and preserving materials. They reached out to local historical societies, cultural organizations, and even schools, forming partnerships that allowed them to reach more families. One particularly meaningful project came from a small-town family who wanted to document their history as the owners of a generations-old bakery. Alex spent hours in the back of their shop, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and pastries, listening to stories of how the bakery had survived wars, economic downturns, and changing tastes. When the book was finally complete, the family invited Alex to their home for a celebratory dinner. They handed him a warm loaf of sourdough as a thank you gift, their gratitude evident in every word and gesture. "It's not just a book," the family matriarch told Alex as they sat together after dinner. "It's a way for my grandchildren to know where they come from. You've given us something we can hold on to forever." Her words stayed with Alex long after he drove home that night. By summer, Family Threads had grown into something none of them had anticipated. Sarah's organizational skills kept everything running smoothly, while Emily's attention to detail ensured every book was as polished as it was heartfelt. Mark, true to his word, became the group's unofficial publicist, using his humor and charisma to promote their work at local events and online. Alex, meanwhile, found himself at the heart of it all. He was the one who sat with families, listened to their stories, and helped them uncover the moments that mattered most. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. One evening, as Alex was sorting through a stack of photos from a client's project, his mother called. "Hey, Mom," Alex said, cradling the phone against his shoulder. "Hi, sweetheart," she replied, her voice warm. "I was just thinking about you. You've been so busy lately. I wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Alex smiled. "I'm good. Tired, but good. This work, it feels important, you know? Like it's not just about the families we're helping, but about keeping these stories alive." His mother was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Alex. I think he always hoped someone in the family would take up his love of storytelling." Alex's chest tightened. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. I've been thinking," she continued. "We've always talked about Grandpa Henry's stories, but I don't think I ever told you much about your grandma. She had some incredible recipes, too." "Really?" Alex asked, intrigued. "Oh, yes," his mother said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "She used to make the best blackberry cobbler. I think I might even have her recipe somewhere. Would you like it?" "Of course," Alex said. "I'd love to add it to the collection." A week later, Alex's mother visited with a small stack of recipe cards, each one written in his grandmother's neat, looping script. As Alex flipped through them, he felt a sense of connection to a woman he had known but never truly understood. "Grandma was the heart of the family," his mother said, smiling softly. "She made everyone feel at home. I think she would have loved what you're doing, Alex." Alex nodded, his heart full. "I hope so. It feels like this is where I'm meant to be." As the months rolled on, Family Threads continued to grow, touching lives in ways Alex hadn't thought possible. Each project brought new challenges, but it also brought new stories. Stories of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds of family. One evening, as Alex sat at his desk reviewing a completed book, he glanced at the framed photo of Henry and Daniel beside him. "I think we're doing it right, Grandpa," he said quietly. "I think we're building something you'd be proud of." And as he looked at the pages in front of him, filled with the faces and voices of people brought together by the stories they shared, Alex knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. By late summer, Family Threads had evolved from a small passion project into a full-fledged community effort. Word of mouth had spread beyond what Alex and his cousins could have imagined. Local libraries, schools, and historical societies began reaching out, asking for workshops and presentations about preserving family history. Alex quickly realized that this work wasn't just about creating books, it was about inspiring others to value their own stories. One Saturday morning, Alex and his cousins hosted their first workshop at a local community center. The room buzzed with excitement as families gathered, clutching old photo albums, handwritten recipes, and keepsakes. The air was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and pastries that Sarah had insisted on bringing. Alex stood at the front of the room, holding a copy of Threads of the Past in his hands. He scanned the faces before him, feeling a mixture of nerves and pride. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite the flutter in his chest. "When we started this project, it was just a way to reconnect with our own family history. But what we discovered is that every family has stories worth preserving, moments that deserve to be remembered." He held up the recipe book, smiling. "This book isn't just about recipes. It's about the people behind them, the memories tied to every dish, and the traditions that bring us together." The room was silent for a moment, and then someone clapped. Soon, the entire room joined in, the sound filling the space and washing over Alex like a wave. For the next hour, Alex and his cousins worked with the attendees, helping them organize their materials and brainstorm ways to tell their stories. Mark, ever the charmer, managed to turn every interaction into a moment of laughter, while Emily guided people with her calm, methodical approach. Sarah floated between groups, offering encouragement and snapping photos for their social media page. One older woman, clutching a faded leather-bound diary, pulled Alex aside. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "She wrote in it every day during the Depression. I've always wanted to share her words with my grandchildren, but I don't know where to start." Alex gently took the diary, flipping through its fragile pages. The handwriting was delicate but clear, each entry a window into a life filled with resilience and hope. "We can help with this," Alex said, meeting her eyes. "Your mother's story deserves to be heard." The woman's eyes glistened as she smiled. "Thank you. That means so much." By the end of the workshop, Alex was exhausted but exhilarated. Families left with smiles on their faces and plans to start their own projects. One woman approached him on her way out, a young boy holding her hand. "Thank you for doing this," she said. "It's easy to forget how important these stories are. You've reminded us to hold on to them." As she walked away, Alex glanced at the boy, who waved before disappearing through the door. In the weeks that followed, Family Threads continued to grow. They launched a website, offering digital tools and resources for families who couldn't attend workshops in person. Alex spent late nights writing blog posts about the importance of preserving history, sharing tips on organizing photos, and interviewing loved ones. One day, Sarah called with exciting news. "You're not going to believe this," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "We've been invited to speak at the State Historical Society's annual conference." Alex sat up straighter, the news sinking in. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Sarah said. "They want us to talk about how we're connecting modern families with their history." "This is huge, Alex." It was huge. The invitation was a sign that their work was being recognized on a larger scale, and Alex couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. The conference, held in a grand old theater, was a turning point for Family Threads. Alex and his cousin stood on stage, sharing their journey with an audience of historians, educators, and community leaders. Alex spoke about his grandfather's journal, holding it up for the crowd to see. "This little book changed my life," he said. "It taught me that our past isn't just something to look back on, it's something to carry forward." And that's what we're trying to do with Family Threads. We're helping people take their stories and turn them into something that lasts. The audience erupted in applause, and Alex felt a lump rise in his throat. After the conference, partnerships began pouring in. Schools wanted to incorporate family history projects into their curriculums. Libraries asked for more workshops. Even local businesses expressed interest in supporting their work. Despite the growing demand, Alex and his cousins were determined to keep the heart of Family Threads intact. "We're not just creating books," Alex reminded them during one of their planning meetings. "We're creating connections. That has to come first." One evening, after a particularly long day, Alex sat in his apartment, scrolling through photos from the conference. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Look what the kids made today." She had attached a photo of her kids holding plates of Henry's Christmas spice cake, their grins as big as their mess. Alex laughed, typing back, "Tell them they're officially better bakers than me." As he set his phone down, his gaze fell on the framed photo of Henry and Daniel on his desk. Next to it was the recipe book, its pages worn from use. "Look at what you started," Alex said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. The journey that had begun with his grandfather's journal had grown into something he couldn't have imagined. It wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about building a future where those stories continued to inspire and connect. And for Alex, that was a legacy worth living for. By autumn, Family Threads had transformed from a small project into something far-reaching, touching the lives of families and communities alike. Every day, Alex saw how the stories he and his cousins helped preserve were more than just words or photographs. They were bridges between generations, binding people to the roots of who they were. But as rewarding as the work was, it also presented new challenges. With growth came higher demand, and Alex sometimes found himself stretched thin, juggling workshops, individual projects, and the overwhelming number of requests pouring in. It was during one of those particularly exhausting weeks that an email from a middle school teacher named Mrs. Turner landed in Alex's inbox. "Dear Mr. Bennett, I've been following the work you've done with Family Threads, and I think it's wonderful. I'd love to collaborate on a project with my students to help them connect with their families' histories. Would you be open to meeting and discussing this?" Alex felt a spark of inspiration reading her email. The idea of engaging young people, helping them discover their roots and see their families in a new light, felt like a natural next step. A week later, Alex sat across from Mrs. Turner in a sunlit corner of the school library. Shelves of books stretched around them, creating a quiet cocoon where the two could brainstorm freely. Mrs. Turner was a petite woman with sharp eyes and a quick smile. She spoke with enthusiasm, her hands often gesturing as if to emphasize the weight of her words. "I've noticed that a lot of my students feel disconnected," she explained. "They don't really understand where they come from or how their families shape the lives they're living now. I want to change that." Alex nodded. "That makes sense. When I first started looking into my own family history, I didn't realize how much it would change the way I saw myself." Mrs. Turner leaned forward. "What if we gave my students a chance to experience that? A family history project, something simple but meaningful. They could interview a family member, collect a story or recipe, and then we'd compile everything into a book at the end of the semester." The idea resonated immediately with Alex. "I love that. It's a way to show them that their family stories matter, even the small ones. And it might help them feel more connected at home, too." The two spent the next hour outlining a plan. Alex agreed to visit the class to kick off the project, sharing his own story and teaching the students how to gather and preserve their materials. Mrs. Turner would guide them in organizing their findings, and together they would create a book, a collective snapshot of their histories. When Alex arrived at the school for the first workshop, he wasn't sure what to expect. He stood at the front of the classroom, a copy of Threads of the Past in his hands, as 20 pairs of curious eyes watched him. "Hi, everyone," Alex began, smiling. "I'm Alex Bennett, and I want to tell you about a little journal that changed my life." He shared the story of how his grandfather's journal led him to discover a side of his family he had never known, tying it to the importance of preserving history. As he flipped through Threads of the Past, he showed them photos and stories that brought his words to life. One student, a boy in the back row, raised his hand. "Do you think stuff like recipes really matters? Like, it's just food, right?" Alex chuckled. "That's a great question. It might seem like just food, but think about it. How many of your best memories involve meals with your family? Those recipes are like time machines. They take you back to those moments and keep them alive." The boy nodded thoughtfully, and Alex could see the wheels turning in his head. Over the next few weeks, the project became a highlight of the school year. Students brought in everything from old photographs to handwritten letters, each item accompanied by a story waiting to be told. Alex visited the classroom weekly, guiding the students on how to conduct interviews and write narratives. One day, a girl named Mia approached Alex with a small, leather-bound journal. "This was my great-grandma's," she said, holding it carefully. "It's in Spanish, and I don't know how to read all of it. But my mom says it's about her life before she came to the U.S." Alex carefully opened the journal, its pages filled with delicate handwriting. The words told of a young woman's journey to a new country, her struggles, and her dreams for the future. "This is incredible, Mia," Alex said. "Would you like to translate some of it with me?" We could include part of her story in the book. Mia's eyes lit up. Really? That would mean so much to my family. By the end of the semester, the class's book, Our Stories, Our Roots, was complete. Mrs. Turner organized an event where the students shared their work with their families. Copies of the book were displayed on a long table, and the room buzzed with excitement as parents and grandparents flipped through its pages. Mia's mother approached Alex with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for helping Mia with the journal," she said. "You've given us a piece of my grandmother we thought was lost forever." Alex felt his chest tighten with emotion. "It was an honor to help," he said simply. The success of the project inspired Alex to expand the idea further. He and his cousins began offering workshops in schools and community centers, teaching young people how to connect with their family histories. Each new project brought fresh stories, reminding Alex that the work wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, too. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alex sat in his apartment scrolling through photos of the workshop. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Mom's birthday is next weekend. Want to come over and help us make Grandpa Daniel's pancakes? The kids say you're the only one who gets them right." Alex laughed, typing back, "Of course. I wouldn't miss it." As he set the phone down, his gaze fell on the framed photo of Henry and Daniel on his desk. Next to it was the original threads of the past. "Look at what you started," Alex said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. The journey that had begun with a dusty journal had grown into something far greater, a mission to connect families, one story at a time. It wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about building a future where those stories lived on, inspiring and uniting generations. And for Alex, that was a legacy worth fighting for. As the crisp air of fall turned into the sharp chill of winter, Family Threads reached a new milestone. The project, born from Alex's discovery of his grandfather's journal, had grown into a movement. More than just creating books or organizing workshops, Alex and his cousins had sparked a deeper awareness of the power of family stories. Requests were pouring in from schools, historical societies, and families who wanted to preserve their histories before the memories faded. Even with the team's careful planning, the sheer volume of work was overwhelming, but it only strengthened their resolve. They weren't just running a project, they were nurturing a legacy. One snowy evening, Alex sat with his cousins at Sarah's house, the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting through the kitchen. The dining table was covered in papers, laptops, and steaming mugs of hot cocoa. Outside, snow blanketed the ground, the glow from the streetlights making it shimmer. Sarah flipped through a notebook filled with to-do lists. "Okay," she began, her voice slightly exasperated. "We've got 3 workshops next month, 2 new family projects starting this week, and a request from the State Historical Society for another presentation." Mark leaned back in his chair, groaning dramatically. "Do we ever stop? Are we allowed to sleep anymore? Or is that considered optional now?" Emily smirked, jotting notes in her planner. "Sleep is overrated, Mark. You're the one who said you wanted to be the face of the operation. Time to live up to it. Don't think I won't start napping during meetings." Mark shot back, though the grin tugging at his lips betrayed his teasing tone. Alex laughed, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for these moments. The playful banter and shared sense of purpose reminded him that he wasn't doing this alone. They were a team, a family, working towards something bigger than themselves. "Actually," Alex said, leaning forward, "I've been thinking about the holidays. With everything we've done this year, I want to do something special, something that ties it all together." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Alex hesitated for a moment before speaking, the idea he'd been mulling over finally finding its voice. "What if we hosted a community event? A celebration of stories? We could invite the families we've worked with, share some of their histories, and encourage others to start preserving their own. It would be a way to bring people together and show them why this work matters." Emily's eyes lit up. "That's a fantastic idea. We could make it interactive. Set up stations where people can scan photos, record interviews, or write down memories." Mark leaned forward, nodding thoughtfully. "And we could showcase some of the projects we've done. People love seeing examples. It might inspire them to start their own." Sarah smiled, her fingers already scribbling notes. "It's ambitious, but I think we can pull it off." Let's do it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The team secured a local community center as the venue and reached out to families they had helped, inviting them to participate. Alex created a presentation that would walk attendees through the journey of family threads, from his grandfather's journal to the lives they had touched along the way. The night before the event, Alex found himself sitting at his desk, surrounded by photos, books, and notes. He opened his grandfather's journal, tracing his fingers over the worn pages. The entries felt alive, as if Henry's voice were speaking directly to him. "What would you think of this, Grandpa?" Alex thought. "Would you be proud of what we've built?" He closed the journal carefully, setting it beside the finished copy of Threads of the Past. Tomorrow, he realized, wasn't just about celebrating their work. It was about honoring the stories that had made it possible. The day of the event dawned clear and bright, the snow glittering under the pale winter sun. Inside the community center, the air buzzed with energy. Families filled the space, clutching old photo albums, handwritten letters, and cherished keepsakes. Tables were set up around the room, displaying items that told stories of resilience, love, and tradition. A large screen near the stage showcased a slideshow of completed projects, while volunteers helped attendees scan documents and record interviews. One corner of the room was dedicated to interactive stations, where children sat with their parents, drawing family trees or writing down memories. Alex stood near the entrance, greeting families as they arrived. His heart swelled as he watched the room fill with laughter and conversation. This was exactly what he had envisioned, a gathering of people united by the shared desire to honor their histories. Midway through the event, Alex took the stage. The room quieted as he stood behind the microphone, his grandfather's journal in hand. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I first opened my grandfather's journal, I had no idea where it would lead me. I thought I was just looking for answers about my family's past. What I didn't realize was that I was starting a journey, not just to uncover my history, but to connect with it." He held up the journal, letting the room see the worn leather cover. "This little book reminded me of something we all know deep down but sometimes forget. Our stories matter. They shape who we are, how we see the world, and how we connect with each other." Alex paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "What we're doing here today isn't just about preserving the past. It's about building a future where these stories continue to inspire and unite us. That's the legacy we're creating together." The room erupted in applause, and Alex stepped down from the stage, his chest tight with emotion. As the event wound down, Alex wandered through the room, stopping to chat with attendees. He paused by a table where a young girl was showing her grandmother a drawing of their family tree. "This is beautiful," Alex said, crouching beside her. "Who's at the top?" The girl beamed. "That's my great-grandpa. My grandma says he was a hero." Alex smiled. "I bet he was. And now his story is part of yours." Nearby, an older man approached Alex, holding a faded photograph of a young couple standing outside a modest home. "This is my parents' wedding photo," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've always wanted to share their story with my grandchildren, but I didn't know how. What you're doing here, it's giving us a way to do that." Alex placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "That's why we're here. Let's make sure their story gets told." That evening, as Alex and his cousins packed up the remaining materials, the warmth of the event still lingered. "We did it," Sarah said, leaning against a table with a tired but satisfied smile. "We more than did it," Emily added. "This was incredible." Mark clapped Alex on the back. "And it all started with you, man. Your crazy idea turned into something real." Alex shook his head, smiling. "It started with Grandpa Henry. I just followed the trail he left behind." Back at home, Alex sat at his desk, the journal resting in front of him. He flipped through its pages, each one a reminder of the journey that had changed his life. Beside it was a stack of thank you notes from families they had helped, their words a testament to the impact family threads had made. Alex picked up one note and read it again. "You've given us more than a book. You've given us a connection to our past and a way to share it with the future. Thank you." As he closed the journal, he looked out the window, where snowflakes danced in the light of a nearby street lamp. "I'll keep going," Alex whispered, his voice firm with quiet determination, "For as long as it takes." And he would, because this wasn't just his story, it was everyone's. Winter felt cozier that year as Alex reflected on everything he had accomplished with his cousins. Family Threads had become much more than a project. It was now a living mission, growing with every story told, with every memory preserved. That Christmas Eve, Alex was surrounded by family at Sarah's house. The scent of pine and spices filled the air, mixed with the laughter of children running around the room. The lights flickered gently on the decorated tree, while in the kitchen, everyone took turns preparing dishes and telling stories. "Remember last year, when the flour flew all over the ceiling while we were making the spice cake?" Mark asked, causing a burst of laughter. "It seems like it's become a tradition," Emily joked, showing the flour stains on her apron. Alex watched it all, feeling the warmth of those moments. He knew that this Christmas wasn't just a celebration. It was living proof of how family stories had the power to unite, to create unbreakable bonds. After dinner, as everyone gathered in the living room, Sarah suggested something special. "Let's share a favorite Christmas memory," she said. One by one, the family members began to speak. Sarah shared about the mornings when she used to wake up early to peek at the presents. Helen reminisced about her and Daniel's first Christmas, when they decorated the tree with ribbon bows because they couldn't afford ornaments. When it was Alex's turn, he held Henry's old journal in his hands. "My favorite memory is something recent," he began. "It was the moment I opened this journal for the first time." Everyone fell silent, paying close attention. "I thought it was just an old notebook, but what I found here were fragments of a story I didn't know was part of me. And by following these clues, I discovered not just Grandpa's past, but also how our stories are connected. This Christmas, all I want is for us to keep creating and sharing these stories. Because in the end, that's what stays." The room was silent for a moment before it was filled with warm applause. Helen was wiping her tears away, while Mark gave Alex a light tap on the shoulder. "You're such a sentimental guy, huh?" he said, smiling. Alex laughed. "Maybe." Later, back at his house, Alex sat at the table with the journal and a cup of tea. The room was lit only by the Christmas tree lights. He reflected on how different this Christmas had been. More meaningful, more purposeful. He opened the journal to the last page, where Henry had written his final words. "Take care of them, Alex. Take care of yourself." Alex ran his hand over the words, feeling the weight of the responsibility he carried, but also the joy of fulfilling what Henry had wished. He knew he couldn't reach everyone in the world, but he also knew that every small story shared made a difference. Now, it's your turn. As Alex and his family's story comes to a close, yours may just be beginning. Christmas is the perfect time to create memories and connect with those you love. And what better way to do that than around a table full of dishes that warm both the heart and soul? In our ebook, Sweet Christmas Memories, Simple Recipes to Warm the Soul, you'll find easy, delicious recipes full of meaning to make your Christmas even more special. These are dishes that bring smiles, memories, and unique moments. They're not just recipes. They're opportunities to create stories that will be remembered for generations. Click the link in the pinned comment and start turning your Christmas into a true celebration of love and connection. Become part of this tradition. Stories shape us, and Christmas is the perfect time to start creating yours. Don't miss any videos. Subscribe now and let us know what you thought of this video in the comments.